guest host, Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsea Yeoman, and I'm so excited for a jam-packed show that we have for you. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't realize that it was Thursday because this week has just been such a crazy, busy week. Lots going on. But I'm joined in studio by Liberty McCarter. She is a writer and she works with First Liberty Institute. She's worked on a whole host of religious freedom issues and broader issues in the conservative movement. So thank you for being with us here today, Liberty.
Thank you, Chelsea. I'm really excited about our conversations today.
Got lots of stuff. We're just going to go there today, guys. I think it's been building. There's a lot going on. So we're going to have a lot of really, I think, robust conversations, hopefully some, diverging views as millennials. But we also have on the line Richard Lim calling us from California. Is it sunny, Richard?
It is very sunny, yes. And there's a little bit of smog, too, unfortunately.
Oh, no. Well, you have a brand new shiny title. So I want you to go ahead and introduce for our audience what your new title and position is.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm at PragerU. I'm basically one of their history geeks. So I make sure that everything they put out is historically accurate. So I'm basically the actually guy, as my coworker says. Actually, that's not true. Hopefully it doesn't become annoying or anything like that. But everything I say here is obviously not in my capacity as PragerU employee, but I am working there.
Well, congratulations on the new role. I can't think of a better role for you because, as we always say, you're our resident historian. Richard brings just a wealth and depth of knowledge to our discussions every time. So in those discussions today, we're going to start with talking about this article that came out of the Daily Wire that talked about a Black leadership group accusing Biden after his State of the Union address, essentially of using Black Americans to win the presidency and then abandoning them. And so I thought that was some very, very strong statements against him, some very powerful statements that were made, and one that we don't typically see come out of left-leaning Black minority groups criticizing Democrat policies publicly. And I think that we do know that President Trump during the election had an increase in minority voters from his previous election. And so I just wanted to talk about that. Are Democrats really the party for minority representation like it's been told to us for years? And then we're going to move on still in the vein of politics, but the future of the Republican Party. We started talking about that on the Millennial Roundtable last week. We're going to continue today getting into some really rising stars in the Republican Party, people who are coming to light. DeSantis being one of those. We're gonna break down Ron DeSantis, not just his COVID response, but really I see headline after headline with his name on it. Enough that I was a little unfamiliar with him, and then I just started clicking on headlines and I got really excited. So we'll start with that, and then a little bit later in the show, of course, we're going to talk about COVID science and the pervasive continuation of a lockdown in some portions of our country, and then we'll probably end with a very historic, monumental day for the pro-life movement in Texas happened yesterday. It's a bill that I personally partnered with people on and worked on, and I'm really excited about, but a really cool heartbeat bill came out of Texas, and one that actually has really strong legal grounds to stand. So we'll get there, but right now let's start talking about Democrats being under criticism by minority parties. So if you go to our website, pointofview.net, you'll be able to read this article or any of our topics today. But members of Project 21, it's a 25-year-old group that calls itself an initiative of the National Center for Public Policy Research to promote the views of African Americans whose entrepreneurial spirit, dedication to family, and commitment to individual responsibility have not traditionally been echoed by the nation's civil rights establishment. And so they came out with a press release last Wednesday after President Biden's speech and said that essentially, this new administration claimed that it would cut child poverty in half. 30% of Black children do live in poverty circumstances, but he has failed entirely to do anything about it. And he said, they said that in the last 100 days, the administration, their as a group, African Americans have the highest level of unemployment of all minority groups, whereas Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans, their unemployment rates are increasing since the COVID decline, but Black is still, their numbers are still declining in terms of employment. And he said that many of the Biden administration policies are actually hurting minority communities. And this was something that we saw on the other side of the spectrum as a comparator. President Trump gained tremendous ground, not to use the word tremendous when talking about President Trump, but he gained 5% of the African American vote and 4% of male Hispanic vote. He increased really in historic ways the numbers of minority voters for him in his second run for office. And that's because his policies, socially conservative and economically, were very, very good for minority communities. And so studies came out saying that was a responsive place for the Republican Party to make sure to acknowledge and be aware of. So, Richard, we're going to start with you. When you read this article, what specifically stood out to you? And do you think it's kind of an accurate representation of what we're seeing politically here?
Well, first, I want to throw out an actually at you.
Yes.
So I think you had mentioned that the group was a liberal group, or maybe I'm not sure if that's what you said, but it's actually a conservative group. And I was really pleased to read it because the spokesperson, or the person at the top of, I think it's Project 21, is Stacey Washington, who is a conservative African American radio host who I've actually been on her show. And she's wonderful. I recommend it, to check it out. But she is, it's great to see this because she's standing up and she's saying, look, African Americans shouldn't be taken for granted. It shouldn't be taken for granted that they're on the side of the left, and we're making our voices heard. And I love seeing that. As somebody who is of minority descent, I love seeing fellow minority conservatives standing up. Now, I would say that the Democrats, and what this group is calling out, is the fact that Democrats love to divide us into groups, blacks versus whites, gay versus straight, etc. But what they don't tell you is that their policies hurt minorities, the ones that they supposedly support. So they won't tell you this, but their higher taxes hurt small business owners, which also happens to include minorities. Illegal immigration hurts workers, which also happens to include minorities. And when you had someone like Donald Trump who is talking about that, not just talking about the usual, throwing out the talking points about, the stuff that the GOP will put out, but actually talking specifically to those business owners who are hurting because of those high taxes, that's why he got more support. That's why Donald Trump made those inroads.
That's right. We can't just brush with broad brush strokes. And I think that there's a lot of stereotypes about this. But you're right. There's different communities that are impacted in different ways by not just economic policies, but even school choice is in a way that's impacted. When we get back, we're going to continue looking at this policy analysis and then some party analysis right after this quick break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us. In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May at the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Chelsea Yeoman, and we have a great show today. We've just been discussing with Richard Lim some of the bad policies that the Democrat Party puts out and the Biden administration puts out specifically in the last 100 days that negatively impact minority communities. And a group called Project 21 called this out on Daily Wire as recently as this week. And they essentially said that Joe Biden used Black Americans to ascend to the White House, but has turned his back on them. And the examples are epic. So I'm going to name a few of those policies, and then Liberty, I'd love to get your input on this. But one is by allowing biological boys to compete in women's sports. It causes Black girls to lose out on college scholarships that could have helped them attain a better life. There is amnesty for millions of Americans, for millions of illegal aliens, and studies like the one from the National Bureau of Economic Research have shown that as illegal immigration increases, jobs become increasingly scarce for Black Americans. I would argue that's broader than just for Black Americans, and that's something that actually I read a study out of BBC that said Hispanic Americans actually are concerned about illegal immigration and things like socialism, for instance, because they are often viewed as one voting bloc, but they're not. Hispanic Americans come from Mexico, from Cuba, from all kinds of different countries, but specifically Hispanic Americans from traditionally socialist or communist countries who have fled and seen the horrors personally of socialism. There's a huge break there between them and the current progressiveness of the Democratic Party and their ongoing trend towards socialism. And they go on in this article. But Liberty, I wanted to turn to you and just get your thoughts on whether it's any specific policies that stood out for you or the broader picture of what the Republican Party can and should be doing to reach out to minority communities.
Right. Well, I think, any American that you ask, hey, do you agree with Martin Luther King Jr.? Don't judge somebody by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. You'd say, yeah, of course. But so often we end up doing just that, or we judge people by the color of their skin or by the community that they come from. And we kind of put a stereotype. And I think both sides tend to do this. For liberals or the Democratic Party, they take the minority vote for granted, as we've said. And they just assume that, well, we're always going to have the minority vote. And so we don't really have to work as hard to truly address the issues that might, be facing those minority communities. And I would say sometimes the Republican Party or conservatives might make the same mistake, assuming that minority communities are going to vote the other way. And so maybe conservatives aren't trying as hard as we should to address some of those issues and realize that, like you said, in this last election, there were historic numbers of minorities that actually voted Republican. And so I would just say this to me just brings up a challenge for all of us to say, when you are engaging somebody first at the individual level, don't make an assumption about what their political views might be or what issues might be important to them just because of how they look or what their background is. And then we need to take that, broader as well politically and say, make sure that we are really addressing the issues facing these communities and not taking their vote for granted, or not just assuming that they're not going to vote so we don't ever have to address those issues at all. Because really everybody is an individual. Everybody has their own story. I think it's kind of offensive to assume that there is a voting block of people who look like this.
A people group, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So everybody is different and they have their own issues and concerns, and we need to just remember that as Americans.
I think that's a really good point that you raise. And if we take the race question or demographic out of it and replace it with women, I think that I've seen even in Texas politics that as suburban regions grew more purple or started trending towards a more Democratic vote in the Trump years, so many of the Republicans just wrote off women in their communities as being Republican voters. And I think that there's a real opportunity for outreach and to bring people in and continue to say, we as a Republican Party have room to grow. We have to continue to reach out to all Americans because we believe in our policies, and we believe that our policies, good economics is going to be good no matter what color your skin is for unemployment. But the same should be true of things like there are great conservative policies, Richard, like school choice to me is one that I'm passionate about, because I think that there are communities, especially in more urban areas, that the public schools, they aren't performing as well. But to allow communities to have choice in schools could be a huge way to advance education and open up charter schools. And I think that's a huge equalizing way to make sure education is continuing to be a priority in all communities. So, Richard, what are your thoughts on either any specific policies you think that are particularly good for these demographics we're talking about, or broader that the Republican Party needs to keep an eye on?
Yeah, one issue that I've thought a lot about is something like occupational licensing reform. There are licenses, certain occupations that have different licenses across the country. And, in certain states, it takes, more years to become a beautician than it does in others. And, then the question is asked, is it harder to make people beautiful in one state versus another state? And if the licenses are too onerous, then you have people like single mothers, you have, some are minorities, some are not minorities, but a lot of these people delay these moves up and their dream jobs because they don't have the chance. They just don't have the time. If you're, raising 3 kids, you have 2 jobs. So on that issue, there's actually a lot of agreement on the Democrats and Republicans to get rid of those things. But you have a lot of rackets going on. You have a lot of there's protectionism for the people, the workers that are already in there. And that's something that I think Democrats and Republicans can come together and expand opportunities for all.
That's a great point, Richard. I think we want our policies to speak for ourselves in general. Any party does. And I think that we saw 4 years of policies really benefit our country, even in spite of COVID. I mean, COVID just stopped our country in its tracks, even economically speaking. And but we survived, and I think we're ready for that next sea change. But however, we're facing an administration that wants higher taxes and just really terrible economic policies. And so, one last thing I'll just highlight on this issue is that it has been shoved down the American people's throats, this racial division in our country and these ideas of rewriting history. And then also now, critical race theory in schools and education being pervasive. And for all, it really struck me that for all of the talk we're seeing out of the media outlets to drum up support for justice warriors on the race issue, we know it's creating a lot of divides. We know it's creating a lot of hostility between people groups where we want to see unity and we want to see healing and moving forward. Do you have anything to add about that, Richard, before we go to our break?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think people in power have an incentive to divide us. I mean, I'm an NBA fan, and Charles Barkley, people love him, people hate him, but he said that he felt the vast majority of Americans are doing their best, but politicians need to divide Americans, and I think that's the Democratic playbook, and it's been that way for a long time.
Yeah, it certainly has. And that maybe we shouldn't assume if we're, that anyone is just going to be, as we said, a voting block here, and say that there are people that are hurting and the people we need to reach out to. But certainly just because one party is claiming their moral ground on racial justice, it doesn't mean that they're actually doing anything to help. And it doesn't mean they're actually putting policies in paper and in place that help. Any last thoughts on this article before we move on, Liberty?
Yeah, I would just say, specifically with the issues of racial division, I definitely think it's true, like Richard said, that politicians, they have an incentive to divide us. But I think I would just challenge, we always have to start at the individual level in our own communities. So when we are addressing these issues, don't shy away from those questions, because like you said, there are conservative policies that benefit everybody. It doesn't matter what community you come from, but really just talk to people and say, okay, what's your thoughts? What is your experience, in this country, with your background or where you come from, and just have an honest conversation. And I think if we're willing to try to listen to each other and understand different perspectives, we can find a lot more common ground than if we just keep drumming this, problem of divide and everything. And so I would just say that's what we need to do more of, and not be afraid of those conversations.
I think you're right. Not being afraid is such a huge challenge, especially in this day and age with cancel culture, and you're just told, well, you just don't understand. Let me educate you on your white privilege. And all of that's really stressful for people who just want to be Christians to brothers and sisters, no matter what they look like. And it's difficult. We're in a difficult climate with this, but I love this article. You can go to pointofview.net and read it, and just see that, we can't assume everybody is feeling the same way about what they're seeing. And I feel sad that a community among us might feel used and might feel taken advantage of. But I hope we can see right through it, look at the facts, look at the policies. Statistics back up a lot of this, and they're out there if you can find them. So we are going to go to a quick break. When we get back, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about DeSantis fever. It's something we see rising. I'm going to call it that. I don't know if it's true, but there are a few big players coming on the scene that we should talk about.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome back, and thank you for sticking with us. I'm Chelsea Yeoman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable, and we've got a great lineup today. We have Liberty McCarter in studio, and then also joining us in studio just now for this last part of our segment is Jonathan Teague. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church, and he keeps us, biblical and on track, but also has like a very great knowledge of current events. So thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
It's great to be here with y'all, ladies.
Thanks. And then Richard's on the line. He's talking to us. We've been talking a little bit about are Democrats really the party for minority representation and some of the impact and the differences between policies and how they're functionally helping or hurting different demographics in our population. But we're moving now to continue the discussion on the Republican Party and the future of the Republican Party. There's been a lot of front runners kind of coming to the surface. I saw a poll that came out that said Senator Cruz is still in the top tier level in terms of popular vote, as is Mike Pence had some support. Of course, former President Trump had a ton of support. But one of the people that has worked his way up in the popular support, especially if you've been paying attention to any news headlines lately, is Ron DeSantis out of Florida. I mean, he has made a lot of news, one for the way he stewarded Florida's COVID-19 pandemic response. He got a lot of, they called him Death Santis for a while, according to this article on Politico that is posted to pointofview.net. But he got some blowback, but it turns out his economy was pretty strongly protected because of his response. The people in Florida, it's warmer there, but they had an easier time in some ways. He was above. Their employment rate is above the national average. Their COVID death rate was above the national average. He did a fairly good job. And then he has just been knocking it out of the park in the headlines for doing things like increasing funding to police in a time where police are under immense scrutiny. He is lifting all COVID restrictions as of July 1. Let's see, what are some of the other announcements on the headlines? He's just doing thing after thing that really, I think, represents his conservative roots that get his base fired up. He is passed sweeping election reforms to rule out mail voting and drop box voting. So on all the conservative issues right now, he's just been knocking it out of the park. Jonathan, what did you think as you read this article, and what are your general views on Ron DeSantis?
Yeah, there was a time I lived in Florida long time ago and loved it. Didn't love the humidity, but loved being near the beach for sure. Florida's an interesting state, always has been, certainly is now. Demographically, that's going to continue to be the case. It trend lines a little bit like Texas in some ways in terms of a place that people in business want to go to. I think DeSantis certainly gets that. Having Donald Trump more or less having a mailing address in Florida probably is in his favor these days, depending on what former President Trump does in 2024. But I don't know, maybe if you put it on the polarity, if the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Wilson, I'm forgetting her last name.
Whitmer.
Yeah, that's right.
Whitmer.
If maybe she's one end of the polarity there, I think she's getting the Courage Medal or Courage Award soon, so that's cool. But Ron DeSantis is maybe on the other end of that polarity in terms of COVID response, in terms of state level gubernatorial leadership. So I think their narratives conflict kind of along the line that the country is a little bit. And so I think people are gravitating to DeSantis in similar ways. Like you're seeing what was national, you're seeing on the state level too. So I mean, you can't deny the results, though, and you can't deny the fact that, particularly how he handles the media, I think is what's so interesting about him.
Yes, that's a great point. I was going to say his media response. I've heard him described as Trump with tact, which is, a force to be reckoned with if they have the policies to back it up. And so that is definitely something he's had quite a bit of honesty with the media, calling it like it is. And that's something that I think conservatives continue to value, is just honesty about what's really going on and calling out the left. I mean, I can't get enough of that. So, Richard, what were your thoughts on DeSantis? You're our political wonk.
Well, first of all, it's refreshing. Being in California, and I had been in California for several months last year, and having Gavin Newsom here dictate where you can and can't eat, shutting down even outdoor seating, which led to unintended consequences, because then people would eat indoors with their friends, and there's a higher risk of transmission there. seeing that versus seeing somebody who faced all the people that said that he was going against science. Well, it turns out when you give people the freedom to deal with their circumstances, with schools or on beaches, they know what to do to stay safe, that you don't actually have to be the nanny government to keep people safe. And so I think DeSantis is proof of that. Now, I know immediately then the question goes, oh, what are his prospects to run for president in 2024? And obviously his name is being mentioned. I just wanted to add that it is way too early, just the caution, the caution in me. No one in 1989 would have bet that Bill Clinton would have won, and no one in 2013 would have bet Donald Trump would have won. So, as far as DeSantis, this is part of a long marathon, and you're going to see people fall behind and get ahead, and who knows what's going to happen. But at the least, we can be happy that there's a governor in Florida that trusts the people over the special interest groups.
Right, Richard, I agree with you that it's far too early, but I do love to see the Republican Party kind of picking themselves up by their bootstraps after what happened in November, and just how, devastating of a blow that was for any Republican. And we've talked a little bit on this show about like the future of the Republican Party, and it is fun to see actors who are strong, have great conservative policies kind of come to the forefront in the headlines and think, what could this look like in a few years? And I don't know if you'd agree with me, but President Trump did come out saying, I hear he got his platform up and running today. So if you're missing his tweets, if you're missing his Facebook, which is still shut down, he's back. And he did mention in a media interview that he could view DeSantis as a great vice president. And this really spoke to me in two ways. One, it means I think he thinks DeSantis is a threat, because the best way to really alleviate that as a threat is to make him your vice, bring him in, right? And two, I think that there's an acknowledgement of strength there. So, Richard, do you agree? Am I crazy?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, the thing is, it reminds me a little bit of Scott Walker when he was doing a lot of great things in Wisconsin. And, sometimes people like that catch fire. Sometimes they're better as governors. So that has yet to be seen. But I think, quite frankly, the Republicans have a deeper bench than the Democrats. When you look at the Democrats, and so many of them Joe Biden is their party leader. So when you look at that and you look at kind of the fresh blood
I laughed so hard.
Republicans, when you look at the fresh blood that the Republicans have, I'm just glad that we have a guy like DeSantis who gives us a deep bench.
Yes, I agree completely. Nikki Haley is also a name I've seen thrown out recently. And so there's just going to be a plethora there. Liberty, what were your thoughts about DeSantis's COVID response, or, maybe his involvement as kind of someone that the Republican Party is starting to take notice of?
Well, I think it's really interesting because we've had this talk about unity among conservatives, because you have the Trump base that is very loyal to Trump and would love for him to run again, probably. And then you had the conservative contingency that really didn't like Trump. And they, some of them held their nose, as we say, to vote for him because of his policies, and others couldn't stomach it just because of some of the things that he would say. And when you said that DeSantis was being described as Trump with tact, I thought that was really interesting because he is a fighter, as Politico describes him in this article. And he's not afraid to call out the left and the media. And I think a lot of conservatives are drawn to that. And I would just, encourage voters to make sure that, yes, we want somebody who can call out the misinformation and can call out unfair policies, but make sure that the policies are also there, behind that person who's doing that. And maybe DeSantis can kind of be that middle ground of somebody who's willing to fight for conservative values, but also willing to have a little bit of tact so that people don't feel so guilty if they're voting for him. He might be that middle ground that can unite the party. And then we'll just have to see, are people going to be willing to unite around him? Is Trump willing to let him unite the party? Right. So that's going to bring up a lot of interesting questions. But I think he kind of has, both things going for him at this point, which will be interesting.
I love that you drew that to light, because you're right. I think at the end of the day, we all want unity. I mean, we have so much ground that if the Republicans win in a few years, we'll have to take back, whether that's taking back the economy, the tax reform issues. There's so many conservative social issues that are just going by the wayside. All the abortion regulations that President Trump made room on being thrown out. I mean, so it's good to see a party. I hope that we will see in the next few years a better sense of unity and direction. And we've got time for that. We've got time to see, as Richard mentioned, people come to the forefront, go to the back burner. But hopefully, I think we'll see it'll certainly shake out in the next few years. Well, we have a quick break to go to, but before that, don't forget to go to facebook.com. You can go to pointofview.net radio, or Point of View Radio or pointofview.net to read these articles. You can see us live on Facebook, and we'll be back after this short break, so don't go anywhere.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back. I'm your host today for the Millennial Roundtable on Point of View. My name is Chelsea Yeoman, and I'm the Texas State Director and National Legislative Advisor with Human Coalition Action. We will later in the show discuss some great news coming out. I do pro-life policy work at the state and a little bit the national level, and we had some huge pro-life wins. So stay with us. We're going to get there towards the end of the show. But before we start there, we are going to talk a little bit about COVID and the continual push for lockdowns and vaccines we're seeing. I think everybody's all over the map on both of those topics. So, we're going to have some great, I hope, robust discussions today, hopefully some diverse perspectives, and we'll get there. But the first article comes out of CNN.com. It's posted to pointofview.net, and it's entitled Biden Sets Goal of Administering at Least One COVID-19 Vaccine Shot to 70% of U.S. adult population by July 4th. So this has just been really an incredibly fast-paced rollout from starting with President Trump, who began Operation Warp Speed, got the ball rolling on all of this, and then they started releasing the vaccines around the time of the election, and since then have administered them in the tens of millions. And so it's already been really just incredible to see how the medical community responded, or the pharmaceutical companies responded as quickly as they did. In terms of just science, I think that it's kind of interesting. But he wants to have 70% of the U.S. population, that would be having 160 million U.S. adults fully vaccinated. And he wants it to be easier than ever to do that. And one shot, I think, makes you a certain percentage of immunity, and then 2 shots makes you even more immune. And we have, just as a number to be aware of in the back of your head, the cases have been on a steady decline since about January 2nd. There are about 45,000 new cases every day, which it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot, but compared to the July or early January numbers, where that number was 250,000 a day, it's pretty significant. So if you keep in account how many people have had COVID and have antibodies, and many doctors think, yes, some antibodies could fade, but there's not really strong evidence of a second reoccurrence of the infection. And then you keep in account how many have currently been vaccinated with at least one shot in this country, which is nearing about 100 million at this point in time. Really, a large part of the population is either immune or has a strong defense, hopefully, to COVID. So we'll start with you, Liberty. On do you think that it's necessary to continue this vaccine push? They're rolling it out in more rural communities, lots of marketing drives, especially in minority communities who are more hesitant to get a vaccine because of some history. They've had historical responses that are not so great to certain vaccines in the past. So there is a skepticism there. Is it good to continue to push this, or kind of like laissez-faire, let people decide?
Well, I think it does come down to personal choice. And so to me, the big issue is as long as people aren't being forced or pressured into doing this. But I am in no way opposed to an educational campaign or just opening up more access, because I think that if people want to get it, and if they would feel more comfortable going back to their normal lives if they have it, then they should have easy access to it. And I think, like you were saying earlier, the fact that this has been rolled out so quickly is really a great thing. And so for people who want to get it, then they should definitely have the option. And so if, the government, no matter who it is, can make it more accessible to people who are interested, then I think that's great. And I know that there's a lot of information about the vaccine and hesitancy, which we might talk about. But I know there is also a lot of misinformation. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with an educational campaign to say, hey, here's what the research says. Here's why you might want to consider it. Here's where you can have access to it if you want to. And I'm totally fine with that.
Richard, you are in California. You were in Washington, D.C. recently. So I don't know that there are major regional differences here in terms of the opinions on this. But do you like to see this big of a push to the American public, or are you more on the laissez-faire side?
Well, I agree with Liberty as far as I think that the element of choice is critical here, because everyone has different circumstances. Everyone looks at things differently. One of the things that's fascinating is that America was actually born out of a pandemic. I mean, smallpox pandemics broke out in the Founding Fathers' time a lot. And in that situation, you often had, this was an era when it was harder to get the kind of information that you have now, where things are instantaneous. But I think the Founding Fathers understood that local control, local choice, giving people the freedom to take the measures that they feel are necessary would work, rather than imposing that choice over any people. And what happened was that America endured through those things. They probably had less means to protect themselves than they do now, but they emerged from that and they succeeded. They created the country that we have today. So I think having that element of choice is critical so that people can make their own decisions that's best for them.
You know, you raise an interesting point because we have seen a push in a way that does impact that choice. I have heard of public educators who were going to lose their jobs if they didn't get vaccinated. People in the healthcare community not going to be able to continue to have a job if they were not vaccinated. I think 100 universities now require it if you're going to attend in-person class. Mm-hmm. So that choice is a question, and it's one we continue to see being applied pressure to in a time where, in my mind, we always say we're not working with the same set of facts we had a year ago. So science knows a lot more, medical community knows a lot more, but the same is true of the vaccine. If we're reaching a point of herd immunity and we're reaching a point where cases are the lowest they've been in 8 months, do we still need to continue to have that choice? Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
I mean, yeah, this is becoming a bigger and bigger an onion month after month culturally. I mean, you look like, for instance, in India, I was having a conversation earlier this week with several folks in our missions team and folks that know what's going on there, and they're in a massive crisis right now. So I think, kind of starting from the obvious, this idea that COVID's not real, it doesn't exist, and it doesn't hurt anybody. I think we need to sort of unilaterally decide that's probably not a good narrative. And so if we work our way back from what's obviously true into what's obviously helpful, and if we use that as a rubric within ourselves and our communities, we begin to start to take sort of like an others first, how can I help you so I can help me kind of idea, which is a biblical premise, by the way. Mm-hmm.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I think when we lean into that, I love Liberty's thought there that, and I appreciate Richard's nod to late 18th century vaccinations, because you would not have wanted to have been vaccinated with smallpox. It was not a pleasant experience. So this
Very
is not
true.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's not a new phenomenon at all. But I do think our desire, honestly, to prefer one another has really been tested through these last 15 months. And I do think the Atlantic article you sent us, I think, really exposes this even deeper. I think this bent towards a massive amount of reactionary fear is really flooding the mind space for a lot of people in critical areas where we need people to be, for lack of a better word, I think now normal. I think we're finding out that there's not as fine of a line between, hey, let's be educated, let's encourage each other, and autocratically and in an imperative, you're going to get it or else. I appreciate President Biden's tone so far. Of all the things I don't agree with him on, I think he is trying to make it hey, let's be patriotic about this. I think that we're long forgetting that the vaccination was created, initiated, and driven forward in the previous administration. And it's like we've got political amnesia on that. And
well,
so
part of it is the media saying, that this is President Biden's big win. And that's you're right. It's factually inaccurate. It's rewriting history. We are going to go to one of those breaks. If you want to call in and tell us your opinion on what we've been discussing today, 800-351-1212. But before that break, we do have to say goodbye to Richard, our historian. Thank you for joining us, Richard. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Well, until next time, Richard, thanks for being with us. When we get back, we'll continue to talk about vaccines on the COVID front.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of view can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221, or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, welcome to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. I'm your host today, Chelsea Yeoman, and we've got a great show lined up today. I'm also joined in studio by Jonathan Teague. He is the minister to married adults at Prestonwood Baptist Church. Thanks for being with us, Jonathan.
Great to be here today.
Yes, it's finally, we're a full studio today because we also have Liberty McCarter. She's a freelance writer and works with First Liberty Institute on all kinds of religious liberty issues. So thanks for joining us, Liberty.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And also by phone, we have Ben Corson. He's joining us. Where are you from today, Ben? Because every time we call you, you're in a different place. So where are you today?
Well, I was in Florida a couple days ago, but now I'm back in Oregon.
Oh, okay. Got you some East Coast representation in here. So thank you for joining us, Ben. We're so glad to have you with us. We've been talking a little bit about President Biden's big push here in this year to roll out the vaccine, and he's continuing to push forward. About 100 million Americans have been vaccinated with at least one shot, but more than that with both shots. But he wants 70% of the population, which would be about 160 million Americans, to be vaccinated with at least one shot by July 4th. While he's doing this, of course, COVID is on almost all-time low. We're getting really down to some lower numbers than we've seen in about 6 to 8 months. So that's really encouraging for people. And we also have to keep in mind then the tons of people who've had COVID who have antibodies, or they believe, even without the antibodies, it might be difficult to get it again, depending on who you talk to. So we've talked a little bit about the importance of choice with the vaccine. And so far, some institutions are requiring you to be vaccinated to continue working there, especially in the healthcare industry. But for largely, there has been a level of choice involved, but we're going to get into it a little bit today. I haven't done this on the show yet. I'm mostly out of nerves. I think that genuinely we're in a climate where if you look at anything with a level of skepticism or want to pop the hood on it and ask some questions, which I always do because I'm an attorney and that's my job, is try to get more information. There's a lot of name calling, conspiracy theorists, there's a lot of that. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you go all in, then there's information that you might be missing or doing that you get called, well, you're liberal. And so there's not a lot. I want this to be a place where we can have a real authentic discussion about what we know, what we don't know about the vaccine, and then how we are personally just grappling with that as millennials from our millennial perspectives. So I'll start in a vein of honesty. As I mentioned, I'm an attorney, so I like to have information first. Well, in the world of a novel virus and pandemic, there's not a lot of information out there. And then a lot of the information you're getting feels biased. And we have an all-time record low as a country of trust in the media. I mean, across the board, regardless of political affiliation, there's a level of skepticism there. And so when I'm looking for articles and studies that doctor friends have told me about, like I heard there's a fertility protein that the vaccine could impact, and that study came out of Australia. And then I go to look for that study and it's on page 8 of my Google search, and it's very difficult to find. Like, that's hard for me as someone who I just want to look at the medical journals. I want to look at the few studies that are out there and what they have to say. And so with me, I did have COVID. I feel like I wear my antibodies. I had to go about normal life. I'm in the middle of session in Texas where I'm running legislation and working really hard with members' teams. So I don't have the luxury of continuing in isolation at home. I have a job to do that I'm called to. And with that, I'm trying to navigate this information, the pipeline of information. Then you have information that says everything's safe and everything's fine and you shouldn't worry. And so I have sought probably 10 doctors in my life that either I'm friends with or I go to or my kids go to and asked a lot of questions. And then they all landed in different spots. So I had one camp that was like, we know enough now about vaccine responses. It's fine. And then I have another camp that is like, you're not high risk. You already had it. I wouldn't get it if I were you. And that's because you could go into overdrive and have an autoimmune response. We don't know enough yet. There's no long-term studies yet. And so I see it on both sides. How have y'all grappled with either the information funnel, the lack of information, or the growing amount of information we're finally having? I mean, these are difficult questions and there's no right answer. But we'll start with you, Liberty. How did you manage this?
Yeah, it was difficult. And I would say just, disclosure, I am 8 months pregnant right now. So
congratulations.
Thank you. But this has, added extra stress to this decision because as somebody who has not had COVID and is a generally healthy young adult, once I was eligible, and I don't have a problem with vaccines in general, so I would probably have said, sure, I'll get it. Just extra measure of protection for myself and other people that I might come in contact with. But then being pregnant, I did have some extra hesitancy. So I was like you, I had multiple conversations with my OBGYN about this every time I would go in for an appointment. And so there is more data now coming out specifically about the, pregnant women getting it and the effect that it has on both pregnant women who are at a higher risk for serious sickness if they are infected and for their newborns. And so what really encouraged me was that they found that if you get it while you're pregnant, you can actually pass immunity on to your newborn. And that, my doctor said that they had not seen any evidence that it would be unsafe. And so that's kind of where I landed on a personal level. But I know that everybody's different. Like for you, who you did have COVID and you had a very strong response, like they said, maybe it wouldn't be a good idea for you to get it. Somebody else who doesn't have, the extra vulnerability of being pregnant and bringing a newborn into the world who is also very vulnerable, they may say, I'm healthy. I don't want to risk it. Because I think my immune response is okay by itself. So I think that it's good to look at all the information to get the different perspectives, like you're saying, and really just kind of make the decision that works for you individually.
That's such a great point. We have just a minute left before break, so I'm going to go to you, Jonathan. But, what about you? How have you guys thought about it?
Yeah, I mean, I did get the vaccine about, the full cycle of it now for about a month for lots of different reasons. I was probably a little slower, a little more hesitant at first. I'm a little bit like that. My wife and I are both kind of research people. We want to kind of watch. Coronavirus is so unique that there was some rush to judgment on both sides, fair or unfair. I work in ministry, you work with a lot of people. It's just kind of like baked in.
Yes,
you can't do church without being with people. And so we just sort of, when thinking about it, honestly praying about it, talking to doctors that we trust, listening, paying attention, trying not to be reactionary, trying.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard not to have that confirmation bias as you hear things.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just probably turning off a lot of social media and just reading, listening, thinking, praying, and weighing it down basically to this. It's like, generally in a lot of similar ways, I thought about the people who didn't get who had to go to work this last year, couldn't not work, had to show up, had to do things. It was just part of. And I started to think, what if we're going to think about this from just a not myself perspective, I didn't see not only not a harm in it, but could there be a help to it as well? And that was kind of the driver for me, is it helps me maybe to set a good example for others, or just be able to show up in different spaces and be present. I'm a people person. That's kind of a thing for me anyways. But yeah, there's certainly a lot that goes into it.
The civic duty side of it, which I think comports with the millennial viewpoint, and our generation's, really does care about that civil component. When we get back, we're going to continue to hear from Ben on this issue and a little bit more on the COVID response.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Today is the National Day of Prayer. It is a vital part of our American heritage. The first call to prayer happened before the American Revolution. In 1775, the Continental Congress called on the colonists to pray for wisdom as they considered how they would respond to the King of England. Perhaps one of the most powerful calls to prayer came from President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. In 1863, he issued a proclamation for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer. Here is some of that proclamation. He said, "We have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved these many years. In peace and prosperity, we have grown in numbers, wealth, and power, as no other nation has ever grown. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God that made us." In 1952, Congress passed and President Harry Truman signed a resolution declaring an annual National Day of Prayer. In 1988, President Reagan signed into law a bill that designated the first Thursday of May at the time for a National Day of Prayer. It is estimated that there have been more than 130 national calls to prayer, humiliation, fasting, and thanksgiving by presidents of the United States. There have been 60 presidential proclamations for a National Day of Prayer because every president has signed these proclamations. Today is the National Day of Prayer. Please pray for this nation and its leaders. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back. I'm Chelsea Yeoman, and we're discussing the COVID vaccine. We're going there today. We're saying, all right, we have a lot of information on both sides. There's confirmation biases on both sides. We're all millennials here. What are we really personally? How do we grapple with the decision to get the COVID vaccine or not? And so far we've got two people, Liberty and Jonathan, who both have at least a dose of vaccination based on like their research and their personal medical decisions. There's no wrong or right answer here. I think we're all like struggling with the same lack of information or like limited amount of information in this novel pandemic. So now we're going to hear from Ben Corson, who is on the phone. Where did you land on this? And then I'll round it out with maybe some disagreements. I don't know, but go ahead, Ben.
Well, I think from the far right in evangelicalism, some claim that it's the mark of the beast. But then if you go pretty far left,
I have not heard that. I have not.
Oh, yeah. I've heard some pretty gnarly suggestions. I think then on the far left, though, you can sort of be a victim of cancel culture if you don't get it. So here's where I come from. Before the vaccine came out, I was starting to study in-depth microbiology, learning that we're 10% human, 90% germs, fungi, bacteria. And one of the biggest things that it was warning against was antibiotics and really influencing your system with foreign bodies that can start to mess with your microbiome in a way that has ramifications or repercussions later on. Now, this had nothing to do with the COVID-19 vaccine, but after reading about that, I became a little bit hesitant to get the vaccine, not for any political or religious purposes, but because of microbiology. That's just a personal take, though, but on a spiritual level, which is something I always like to bring in, Psalm 91 says that we're not to fear the pestilence or the disease that walks about in the night, or the destruction at noonday. And what's interesting is there's an old English ancient manuscript that renders that word pestilence as goblins, and the word destruction is devils. So that's kind of what COVID-19 and the vaccine has felt like to people, like goblins lurking in the night, devils destroying in the noonday. But the Bible says that's not something we're to fear. So whether you are called to take it or not to take it, we aren't to be afraid of the disease nor of the vaccine in regards to us being true to and courageous in what God has called us to.
Well, Ben, I appreciate your perspective so much, not just because I agree with you, but because I think that's so true. We have lived in a world of fear mongering for over a year now. And I always get concerned, even among Christians whom I love, the most rational, intelligent Christians in my life. Some of them have been absolutely paralyzed in fear for months, now a year of their life. And it breaks my heart because, I agree with what you're saying. And we're going to get on a little bit later in this segment about the science denial and continuing to live in fear. And at what point do we start to say, all right, we've got our vaccines. We've got a culture that is largely immune. Is it time to venture out? But before we get there, I'm going to wrap up this discussion because I think what you hit on something that I agree with, Ben, as a divergent view, maybe as a millennial here, where I didn't think there's enough information for me to feel that comfortable about the vaccine, to be honest. And once I read some articles about what mRNA DNA is mNDNA or whatever they call it, and how it impacts your cells. And then a study came out very recently in the last month that said if you have a genetic predisposition to autoimmune diseases, it has been shown to start triggering that in some rare cases in women my age. All of a sudden having very extreme rheumatoid arthritis within 3 weeks of getting the vaccine, or triggering other autoimmune issues. And so I've heard, some doctors told me, well, most vaccines have the symptoms show up within the first 6 weeks. But then I thought, this is a very unique vaccine and it's not like most vaccines. So it's okay to have that hesitancy. And I'm going to raise my hand and say, I've been called, are you just a conservative? And I don't think that's fair. I think it's okay that I read 5 medical journals last week, and they're all international. They're from Sweden. They're from Australia. They're different journals that are coming out that are saying, hey, we have cause to say we don't know enough about the long-term impact. And if I, in my age group, with my medical history, say, I'll take my risks on getting it again, at this point. Or one study came out saying if you have already had it, if you're one of the people who had a very strong response, which I did, it was not a picnic. I'm not one of those people you hear say it was the flu. I ended up in the hospital. I'm fine. But they said if your body's already in immune overdrive and you get the vaccine, they're showing a much stronger effect for negative, impact of that. And so I'll just be the naysayer as a millennial and say, it might be, yes, we can think of our civic duties, and yes, I want to be cautious for others, but I think it's okay to be skeptical. And in this information age we're in, I want us to be able to have these conversations like we did today, where we diverge and we say, your decision was right for you, my decision is right for me, but we're not going to start labeling each other one way or the other, which is the goal of the show. But to get on a little bit, Ben, with what you were speaking to, which is this living in fear, what we've continued to see, we have an article on pointofview.net from The Atlantic that talks about the COVID-19 science denial and the continuation of a really extreme lockdown. And so they're finding in some studies that came out in this article that the more liberal your affiliation politically is, the more likely you are to do things like get vaccinated and wear masks outside, continuing to socially distance if you go outside. I mean, some people are still in full lockdown mode. On the break, Andrew was reminding me that he saw this video of Vice President Kamala Harris and her husband, who are both fully vaccinated, wearing masks outside and kissing with their masks on. And so I'm going to be on the other side of this, where I look at that and I'm like, then why get vaccinated? Live your life in freedom, right? But any thoughts on that, Ben? Especially, I really liked your perspective on for Christians who maybe do find themselves continuing to be fearful. How do they come out of that a little bit to the next phase?
Yeah, well, something that the Bible tells us to do is be anxious for nothing. It doesn't say be anxious for some things, be anxious about COVID, be anxious about the disease. No, it says be anxious about nothing, and in everything with prayer and supplication and thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Now, two things. Number one, that word guard in Greek is used of a prison sentinel to stand watch over a captive. So when the Bible tells us to take our thoughts captive, that peace of God, when we pray, will actually be a prison warden or sentinel over our hearts and minds to make sure that the bad thoughts don't run amok. And the second thing I would say is when you pray, talk to God about your hopes, fears, and dreams regarding the season that you're living in. And science shows us it has the same effect on your brain as therapy. I mean, that's pretty amazing. So science shows that if you talk to a loving God about your hopes, fears, and dreams, it has the same effect on your brain as therapy. And I think that's very pertinent and relevant to this current season we're in with COVID and vaccines.
Wow, Ben, I just got the Holy Spirit goosebumps on that. I mean, that's just so true.
Nice.
No matter where we are, we can just submit that to him. And we have, as a culture, as a society, been through a lot in the last year. No one's life has been unaltered in the last year. And to know that we have hope, we can turn to, and we have faith and profess a higher being than ourselves, but also a higher future than ourselves. I love that. Well, Sam from South Carolina is on the line, and he has hung through with us for a little while here. So, Sam, I do want to go to you and just get your perspective as we close out. We've got about a minute left before the break, but thanks for joining us, Sam. I'd love to hear your perspective on our topic today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm on the road back into South Carolina. However, so I heard earlier someone said about choice, and 100 universities have already had the you have to have a vaccine to attend. And I just think in this time in America where we are today, our freedoms are being taken so fast. And so you have to have a choice. You have to stand up for choices, especially if you think of this, like COVID, it's everywhere. And they just said the verse about be anxious of nothing, but in everything prayer and supplication. Like, who are we as Christians putting our trust in? And then if you look at the statistics of it, I mean, it's a 97% chance that if you get COVID, that you'd be okay. Or I don't even know if that's even if you get it. I think that's just that you won't even get it. So the statistics are so in our favor, and then you double that down with the information on how fast they develop these vaccines, with them being a really untested RNA, which is something that's never been given to humans. So, I'm a financial planner, and I deal with buying individual companies all the time, pharmaceuticals and Johnson & Johnson, and I have reps that push this stuff and talks about biologicals, and so I learn from here and there and such like that. But I just feel like there's so little information out there long term on these vaccines. And so in a state of where we are today, and we walk outside, there is not anyone dying. We don't see them on the roads.
Right. Well, thank you, Sam, so much for your perspective. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned. When we get back, we'll turn towards a big pro-life win out of Texas.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
Well, thank you for hanging in there with us. I'm Chelsea Yeoman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable. And we've had some great perspectives on the COVID vaccine. And we've been talking a lot about this idea of fear and like how much, regardless of where you land on these issues, anyone's choices are being driven by fear. People are out of fear, get the vaccine. People out of fear don't get the vaccine. And, you know, Ben Corson is on the line with us. And he made some great points about the role of faith and prayer and just trusting the Lord. I mean, we are in a fallen world. We're in a sick world, and that's going to be the world that we live in as Christians, but we have hope outside of it. And so, Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you now because we have this Atlantic article we're going to wrap up our discussion here with, and it just talks about the continuation. They did a study that said the more liberal you are on the spectrum, the more likely you are to continue like your absolute lockdown. Now, there's going to be granularity here, so I don't want to paint with too broad of brushstrokes, but overall, the study did find that just liberals can't quit the lockdown is what it's called. And we're seeing people who have been completely vaccinated outside wearing multiple masks. If you're Kamala Harris, you're kissing your husband outside with your mask, although you're vaccinated and surrounded by people who are vaccinated. And so at what point do we as a society, as we are fastly approaching herd immunity, at what point do we start to turn away? Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's because we were talking about this during the break too, because I love that passage, Ben, that you shared is one of my favorite from Philippians. And I've quoted it to myself many times over the years, and for sure the last several months, because we know with young adults, statistically, relationally, conversationally, in our friendships, we know a lot of younger people, the issues of skepticism, cynicism, and even anxiety and fear all manifest themselves pretty regularly in a lot of different ways, but they seem to really been exacerbated during the pandemic and in particular ways. And I find it interesting. I just think this is interesting. The conflation between choice and fear, because if you were listening earlier to our discussion and the perspectives, essentially everyone's essentially offering a variety of perspective.
Right.
But everybody was to a place where we could hear each other, celebrate the expression of those choices, the freedoms, work together, think together, and it's totally cool. I think that when you get to and I think that Atlantic article really kind of creates a caricature of where some folks are, where the fear and anxiety is so heightened and it's so palpable that rather than being able to celebrate what is honestly a progressive ideal, which is choice, or a different world would be pluralism, which is a word Kirby uses all the time on this show. Pluralism is basically the idea where all of our ideas kind of eat from the same trough and it's all fine. But eventually your truth and my truth and their truth can't always be true. Somebody has to find truth in there somewhere. But it's interesting to me, the more scared you are, the less interested I am in how many choices you have. And the more scared I am, the more monolithic my world becomes. And I think to Ben's point earlier, this idea that when we lean so hard into fear, we sort of lose ourselves a little bit. And all of a sudden now you don't get choices anymore. And if you don't wear a mask, and I don't have antipathy against people who wear masks at all. I've got mine in my pocket right now and I'm vaccinated. But I think it's like, well, if you don't wear a mask and if you haven't done this and if you're not doing that and if you haven't built these infrastructures and if civically we can't mandate these things or you can't go to school without, well, wait a minute, now all of a sudden my ideal of choice has dissipated into I'm scared. Therefore, if you're not scared, you don't care. That's
Jonathan,
a slippery slope.
I'm going to take a little bit different of approach with you because I don't think it's just out of fear. What we're seeing, especially this Atlantic article, was very telling to me. I had no idea, but they were saying there is a town in Massachusetts that's like one of the most socialist towns based on like 70% voted for Bernie Sanders. Okay. And they are saying like they're using it to completely, they're the last town holdout opening schools. I mean, they still don't want. And so it actually, I think it's a little more nefarious in some ways than you're suggesting. I think there's the crowd that is fearful and respectful. Then there's the patriotic civic duty crowd. I don't want to make this synonymous with patriotism because that's Biden's line. And it really frustrates me. I think I can be a patriot and say, I make with self-governance my own decisions and I'm doing the best I can as a Christian in society to love others well, but live my life and do what I'm called to do too. But then there's this crowd that's saying we're going to continue to shut down out of control. And because we want the government to be the savior. And in this article, they did quote from the Democrats that we should never go back to where we were before because this is an opportunity to take advantage of and broaden government impact in our lives. Liberty, I'm sure you read that part. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think what this article exposes is a broader trend in our society where we are placing our identity primarily in our politics. Other, sources of identity like membership in a church or community have been falling away, as we've seen in recent years. And so it's really interesting because, I saw some quotes in this article and in some other recent articles as well, where people are like, I am vaccinated and I feel like I'm probably safe to not wear a mask outside. But I don't want people to think I'm a Trump supporter.
Right.
And then on the flip side, though, I've heard people say, I don't want to wear a mask because that's what liberals do. It's kind of like the rebellious teen who they do something not because they want to, but because it's going to make their parents mad. And we all kind of laugh at those people, or maybe we were those people. But I think we're seeing the same thing now. So I would just encourage people, do your research, make your independent decision. Don't be reactionary. Don't do something just because, conservatives are opening up. And even though the science says that's safe now, we're going to, live in a perpetual pandemic. That doesn't make any sense. You're just harming yourselves because you're trying to make a political point, and you can't think any broader than that. You can't think for yourself. So that's kind of what I got out of it.
I think that's a true point about hurting credibility. And I'm going to use this as a moment to transition because, Jonathan, we were talking on the break about the irony of the idea that I have bodily choice.
Right.
In the sense that I could legally kill the unborn child growing inside of me, but I don't have bodily choice to resist a vaccine or, when it comes to other people. So I am going to transition now because I think that this is relevant, but also huge pro-life news and victory coming out of Texas. Today was the final vote, but a novel version of the heartbeat bill came out of Texas. And I am the Texas State Director and National Legislative Advisor for Human Coalition Action. And we advocate for pro-life policies. And this was one of them. And we are so excited for the leadership in Texas, but it is a legally novel type of heartbeat bill. As you may know, 13 heartbeat bills have been passed in other states. Those, except for the more recent ones, have all been enjoined in a court of law. But the Texas version is so different. It's going to be extremely difficult for an abortion provider to challenge the law. And that is because the law is there's a bunch of loopholes in federal procedure. I'm not going to bore our audience too much with that, but essentially this law says it's not enforced. It is illegal to conduct an abortion on a child after that child has a heartbeat in the womb. And that's a moment in time that's really important for humanity, but it's indication of strong life. And the child is, I think, upwards of 85% more likely to be born alive and healthy at the point that it has a heartbeat. And so it's a very significant moment in time. So this law is not enforced by government actors. There's no police officer going to show up at an abortion provider. It's exclusively done through civil lawsuits in state court, which means you or me or pro-life entities can sue abortion providers who conduct illegal abortions under this bill. And because of that, a federal court doesn't have a government entity to enjoin or to stop from enforcing the bill. It's brilliantly done. It's different. Of course, abortion providers, when they are inevitably sued in state court, can raise their constitutional defenses, and we'll see at that point in time. But it's different. It's unique. So, Ben, I'm going to start with you before I break in about a couple minutes. Did you read the article? And, it's different. It's Texas, but what were your initial thoughts when you read it?
Yeah, well, with Senate Bill 8 and just studying a little bit about this, banning doctors from performing abortions after the fetal heartbeat is detected, I was actually surprised by how much it won. I mean, I know it is Texas, but 83 to 64, that's a pretty impressive coup, or victory, I should say, coup de grace. The thing is, that heartbeat usually occurs as early as 6 weeks into a pregnancy. And I think that the church, I have a good friend who is an outspoken sort of voice for Saving the Storks is what it's called. And he's a leading voice. Have you heard of that before? It's a pretty powerful organization.
Yes.
But I think that the church is so behind this because let me just read you a few verses that the Bible has regarding the importance of life in the womb. So here's Job 10. It says, "You knit me together with bones and sinews." Matthew 1:20 says, that Mary was told that which was conceived in her, speaking of her baby, is from the Holy Spirit. Psalm 127 says the fruit of the womb is a reward. Luke 1:15 says he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. Again, Isaiah 49 says the Lord called me from the womb and formed me from the womb to be a servant. And lastly, Paul in Galatians 1:15 said, God set me apart from the time I was born. He showed me his grace by appointing me. So Paul, these biblical characters almost felt destiny from their mother's womb. And I think that that's very, very powerful when considering this bill that was just passed in the Texas House.
Yes, Ben, you're so right. I always say it, the Christian worldview, because of our biblical view on humanity, that we're made in the image of God with a divine purpose. Our days are set out before us. The Christian worldview is the reason to be pro-life. So when we get back after this, we're going to talk more about those differences between the Christian worldview on life and what we heard yesterday from the floor in the Texas House.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, welcome back here to the Point of View Millennial Roundtable. We are discussing a historic day yesterday, frankly, out of the Texas legislature. They passed a completely new version of a heartbeat bill, and one that is extremely constitutionally sound, going to be extremely difficult to challenge, and really provides a lot of hope for unborn children in the state of Texas. And before the break, Ben really went through just what the Bible has to say on the importance of life and human dignity. And, we mentioned that the Christian worldview is the strongest worldview to really be pro-life, and that's because we believe humans have inherent dignity and they are good, and that view really came out in the floor debate of the Texas House. Just how bifurcated people who are pro-abortion versus pro-life are on this issue. I mean, there was not a lot of middle ground to be had. It was a hotly debated issue. But I'll say there were some interesting things that were said. Representative Donna Howard, who is a Democrat who is very pro-abortion, said this is the worst day of session, every single session, and this stuff keeps coming up. You guys know there have always been abortion and there always will be. But Representative Slauson, who sponsored the heartbeat bill and was just a champion yesterday on the floor, she just said this is the best day for tens of thousands of unborn children. We have 60,000 abortions a year in the state of Texas. And to say we're going to start being a voice for the voiceless and protect those children and they have value, that was such a powerful thing that happened. So we saw the Democrats come out with some very interesting arguments I have never heard before. They claim this was just ironic to me. I'm going to be a little sarcastic here, but like, this is the party of science. Okay. We're saying the Republicans said, and the sponsors of this bill said, at the moment in time that there is a human heartbeat that is significant. Of course, conception is when we really believe life begins, but when there's a heartbeat, that is a biological moment in time. 95% of biologists now have a consensus, regardless of political views. There were 1,000 that were studied that said 95% agree all of the components of life are present at the moment of fertilization. And so life begins at conception. We now know that. We know about DNA. There's so many things in the last 48 years we now know about life we did not used to know. So we're really saying, like, science is on our side. Like, this is a human. It has growing cells. It is not fully developed or formed, but that doesn't make it not a human or not a life. That's mostly the argument that you could kill a 2-year-old. Are they less valuable than killing a 40-year-old? Of course not. They're human. Right. But they said that actually what's being interpreted on the floor yesterday as a heartbeat in these bills is actually what they're calling electrically induced flickering of a portion of fetal tissue that will become a heart as the embryo develops. And, I laughed out loud. Like, that's the party of science. Like, they claim science all day long. But the truth is the heartbeat has always been called a heartbeat in a sonogram by doctors from the beginning of time. When you hear it, it's an indication of your child's vitality in the womb. And I was just blown away. They're now making the argument that a heartbeat is not a heartbeat. It's a electronically induced flickering of potential tissue in the womb. And it blew my mind because the heartbeat range doesn't change throughout pregnancy. The heartbeat you hear at 6, 8, whatever time you hear the heartbeat for the first time developmentally, it doesn't change the range of motion. So you're pregnant. I want to hear from you, Liberty, on your thoughts on this, anything we've discussed from the biblical worldview to the debate to science.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting when I saw that in the article. I was kind of like, wait, what? Okay, so it is a heartbeat. You're just describing it a little differently. It's semantics, I guess. Because, yes, at 6 weeks, the fetus, the baby, is not completely developed. It doesn't look like a baby will look 9 months later when it comes out. That doesn't mean it's any less of a life. And I think this is where you really have kind of ideology combating science, because if you look at the scientific definition of life, like you said, 95% of biologists agree that it begins at conception, because there is an interdependent life embryo that is created at fertilization, where it's not just, and then you hear also, I've heard, well, what about a cell in my cheek or something? That's living too. It's different than an interdependent, life form that is going to just continue to grow. And so I think it's just, people are bending over backwards on the pro-abortion side, trying to find any way to discount the science that we're seeing. That confirms our biblical worldview, that from the very beginning, this is a human life and it is precious and it's worthy of defense, regardless of how small it is, because it's that slippery slope. If you say, well, you can kill it here. Well, what about, at the end of the first trimester? What about at the end of the second trimester? It's looking more like a human baby at this point. What about a little bit after it's born? What about, there's some disability there. Like, you have to draw that line, say, are we going to protect life or not? So,
yeah. Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, the ideological barrier that you have to build to become such a narcissist that protecting life really isn't a big deal until it directly affects me. Mm-hmm. So none of us, if we were that little electrical reaction happening at a few weeks old, would like the idea of being talked about the way we talk about these unborn babies.
Yeah.
We wouldn't love that. And so you have to build out, and I want to, if you'll allow me quickly, I want to bifurcate some of the issue here. Like, because for instance, I think y'all know this about our church and many, many churches like us. We have a vibrant pregnancy center ministry, and we're all in on engaging women who have difficult choices to make, find themselves pregnant, don't know what to do. And the husbands or fiancés or boyfriends or men that come with them, by the way, too.
Right.
That ministry is expanding that space as well. I always, as a pastor, want to be thoughtful about the women sitting in our congregations or hearing this conversation who maybe have had an abortion. And they wonder, well, I made the choice that I made wherever I'm at in that catharsis. When they're sitting in that room at our pregnancy centers, we want to engage them and love them and tell them they have value, that baby has value, that whatever's happened in your life that's not all that has to define you. And I think what's sad to me is the political calculus that comes into play there is so dehumanizing to say that I have to ideologically plant my flag at telling that woman in that moment in time when she's in crisis and need and worry and doubt. Talk about anxiety. That we have no political answer for you at all, except your baby doesn't get to live. Your baby shouldn't live. To me, that is wildly irresponsible as a society. It's biblically wrong. We know that. We just go back to Ben's argument. Ephesians 1 is another great place. God, before the foundations of the world, God knew me, knew who I'd be, where I'd go, that I'd believe, all these different things. So you're kind of interrupting God's sovereignty to say he knew me before the foundations of the world, but for the 9 months in the womb, he forgot. Then he remembered me again when I was born. Like, it doesn't conflict with the biblical worldview. And I think it's actually very disrespectful to women who are trying to work through these issues and these questions and these crises. And it's actually robbing us of our ability to love them the way they deserve and these babies when we just decide that ideologically it's more important for me to score political points with a base one way or the other than it is to do the right thing for people. And it actually really, really bothers me.
Right.
As a dad and as a husband, it really bothers me.
It does me too, but the truth of the matter is that there's so many Christian organizations dedicating to serving women out there. They outnumber abortion clinics 4 to 1. So the good work is being done. If you want to learn more about that good work, go to humancoalition.com. That's our clinic side of my organization, serving women day in, day out, or hucoaction.org if you want to hear more about the policies being implemented. Very exciting work there. We're going to round out our discussion real quick. Ben, thanks for joining us by phone. Tell our audience where they can follow you and learn more.
You can just go to bencourson.com. That's bencourson.com, or just type Hope Generation into YouTube, and we have almost 800 videos there.
Awesome. Liberty, go ahead and tell everybody where they can follow you.
You can look at libertymccarter.com and see my social media links there.
She does a great job writing. And Jonathan?
Yeah, on Twitter at Jonathan_Teague. You can also find out more about some stuff that we're doing now with future leaders in the church at the Prestowin Residency that we're going to be working on. I'll tell you more about that next time, but there's some cool stuff going on there too.
Oh, I love that. Well, thank you guys for joining us today in our discussion. We covered a lot of topics. We did not hold back at all. So thanks for hanging in there with us. I'm Chelsea Yeoman, your host today for the Millennial Roundtable. Until next time, when we talk about other issues from a millennial perspective.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.